Good evening. It's wonderful to see so many faces here this evening. So many beautiful faces, as Dr. Angelo correctly noted. I'm honored to introduce our esteemed guest this evening. I first met Mr. Zellner and his incredible partner, Pamela Smith. If you could last spring, as we traveled together on the civil rights pilgrimage. Mr. Zellner was one of the foot soldiers on the bus. Mrs. Smith is also extremely involved in fighting for the rights of others. She champions women's reproductive rights and the rights of Native Americans. It is exceptionally challenging for me to describe how impactful Mr. Zellner's presence was on the journey. Through the emotional delivery of myriad stories about his involvement in the modern civil rights movement, Mr. Zellner frequently moved people to tears and often to action. He always left us in awe. How can one not be amazed by a person who nonchalantly begins a story with, while I was sitting in the Oval Office speaking with LBJ, or Dr. King told me XYZ. I won't provide too much information about Mr. Zellner's background, as he will be discussing that this evening. But as you know, he is a white man from Alabama, whose father and grandfather were both in the Ku Klux Klan. Mr. Zellner instead chose a path, a different path, that allowed him to dedicate his life to social and racial justice. It was a path that alienated him from members of his family, but placed him in a position to profoundly affect change. He was the first white Southerner to become a field secretary for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC. This, however, was simply the beginning of his activism. Mr. Zellner continues to advocate for the racially oppressed and economically marginalized. He sets an example for all of us of dedication and perseverance. Mr. Zellner's book, The Wrong Side of Murder Creek, a white Southerner's struggle in the freedom, a white Southerner in the freedom movement, is available on Amazon. I strongly encourage you to purchase it. It is wonderful. There's also a movie that is in production about his life, and I will let him tell you more about that. Let me tell you a little bit about the format for this evening. So Mr. Zellner will not speak for the entire time. He'll speak for a relatively short time, and then he very much encourages you to ask questions. And to that end, we will have a couple of volunteers who will float through the auditorium with microphones, and so simply raise your hand and somebody will come to you with the microphone and you can ask the question. So please, we encourage you very much to ask any question that comes to mind. Without further ado, please help me in welcoming Mr. Bob Zellner.
Dr. Scott, thank you. Thank you, Aaron, all the people who made this possible. Thank you for having me tonight. Pamela and I are very happy to be here at this particular time because many of the things that we talk about on our speaking tour, and I think we've been on basically almost nonstop speaking tour since about January the 15th. So if we're a little bit tired, I hope you'll forgive us. But I've been very energized by our visit to Hood College, the diversity, the depth of your college experience here, and it's very, very impressive, and I'm very happy to be here. I am Bob Zellner, and I grew up in LA, Lower Alabama. And it was very unlikely that I would become a member or activist in the civil rights movement because of my daddy and granddaddy being in the Ku Klux Klan. I want to talk to you a little bit tonight about growing up in South Alabama in the 30s and the 40s. I was born in the 30s during the Depression, and I'm still here. So a lot of my message to young people is that you're going to live in 3 centuries. Most of the college students weren't born in this century, they were born in the last century. And you're not going to drink too much, you're not going to drug too much, eat good vegetarian food, right? So you're going to live in 3 centuries. I especially enjoy talking to the young people because they're going to have so many careers. Many of us in the movement that are lucky to still be here have had many careers. One of them, make one of your careers a giving back career. When I was growing up in South Alabama, I was very lucky that my father was able to break away from the Ku Klux Klan. When my father left the Ku Klux Klan, his father, my grandfather, and my grandmother disowned him. His father and mother disowned him. And maybe the only thing that I can think that would be similar would be people who come out maybe in the LGBTQ movement and they're disowned by their families. Other people in this particular political climate may be rejected by their families because they take another political direction. But growing up in Alabama, it was necessary to grapple with the things that were happening. I was very lucky because not only did my dad leave the Ku Klux Klan, but Daddy began to work with Dr. King and Mrs. Rosa Parks and others who had made the movement. Well, I didn't know a lot about that as a young person, but I went to college. I went to high school, graduated high school in 1957. And I went to high school when the first black student went to the University of Alabama, authoring Lucy. And I realized that I was very lucky that I had been raised by parents who had rejected the Ku Klux Klan and had rejected their fundamentalist Christian upbringing to be more progressive and more liberal looking. Mother's family came from Native American family. They were basically Apalachicola Creek Indians. And so my mother's side of the family was not Klan-minded the way my father's side of the family was. And I remember as a small child, after my father had wrestled with the angel long enough so that he had finally quit the Ku Klux Klan and inherited the ire of his family, my mother gleefully took his Klan robes and cut them up and made church for us 5 boys to go to Sunday school in. So I might have been the only, our little family might have been the only boys going to Sunday school in recycled Klan robes. So some of us may have had to do that in our own upbringing. Well, I'm going to see if that walk around mic will work for a little bit so I can get a little closer to you. I think it's working all right. Is it working good? Yeah. Okay. To tell the story, I'm going to ask if you can put up the lookbook. This is the cover. You've seen the cover of the my memoir, and this story people think is so important that they're beginning to try to make a film from the movie. This is a picture of me and some of my SNCC and CORE friends. CORE was a Congress of Racial Equality back in 1963 when we had taken up the march of a person from Baltimore, Maryland, from this very state. William Moore was a mailman from Baltimore, and he came down to the South, and he was going to practice his trade of walking. He was going to walk from Chattanooga, Tennessee, all the way through Georgia and Alabama into Jackson, Mississippi, to take a letter to the governor of Mississippi asking him to help people register to vote instead of killing people who were black who wanted to go down and register to vote. So this is the beginning of the story. Basically, when young people got together and began to try to do something about the situation we found ourselves in. Well, let me tell you a little bit about how I got to that point. I was very lucky because Daddy was a minister, and my older brother was a Methodist preacher. My granddaddy was a Methodist preacher. So it was natural that I would go to Huntington College in Montgomery, Alabama. When I went to Montgomery, Alabama, this is one of the statements, by the way, that of support for the movie by Dr. Maya Angelou. She realizes that this is an important story. Well, when I got to Huntington College in Montgomery, Alabama, I found myself in a sociology course. It was a senior level sociology course, and we were all given an assignment to study the racial problem and write a paper about solutions to the problem. Well, when we told our professor, after doing all our research in the library, that we were going to go and interview Dr. Martin Luther King and Mrs. Rosa Parks and E.D. Nixon and the other people who made the Montgomery bus boycott, our professor said, "You can't do that." And we said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, of course you'll be arrested." Well, we were young sociologists, and our sociological imagination was piqued by the idea that you could be arrested doing research for a paper. So we said, "Well, we don't think we'll be arrested, we're just doing research." And he said, "You don't know a thing about race relations in Alabama." And we said, "That's why we're taking your course, to learn about race relations." He said, "Well, you can't go." Well, we were enterprising students, so we sought out Dr. King. We found him in the federal court building in Montgomery. In those days, you usually find Dr. King in court somewhere. So the five of us went down, and we very timidly asked Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King if we could come, because we had heard that he was going to have a workshop at Reverend Abernathy's church in Montgomery, Alabama. And some of the people from SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, were going to be there, so we'd like to come. So Dr. King said, "Well, you can come, but you better be prepared to be arrested." And we said, "Well, that's what our professor said." And he said, "Well, that's why he's a professor. He knows about that. But you can come, but you better be prepared to be arrested." So we went to the workshop in Reverend Abernathy's church. And sure enough, after the workshop and after listening to Dr. King preach and so forth, at the end of the afternoon he came over, and I thought with a twinkle in his eye, because he was pretty funny in those days, he looked at us, five little white boys, and he said, "The church is surrounded, the press is out there, the police have surrounded the building, and they're going to arrest the five of you." And I said, "Dr. King, we need to escape." He said, "Well, you remember that little workshop we had, right? That you might be arrested." I said, "What I mean is we need to try to escape. We don't want to get our parents in trouble. We don't want to get our school in trouble, and so forth." Because we were violating the segregation laws. We knew that, but we knew we had a right to do that. So he said, "Well, I tell you what I'll do. I'll go out the front door, and Reverend Abernathy and Mrs. Parks can take you down to the basement, and there's a back door. I'll go out the front. If they all run around there, and they'll open the door, and you can run for it." So while we were waiting for Dr. King to go out the front door, Mrs. Parks, St. Rosa Parks, touched me on the elbow, this elbow. I haven't washed it since then. And she said, "Bob, when you see something wrong, you have to do something about it. You cannot just study the question. You've got to do something." So that was really my introduction to the Civil Rights Movement. And how could you not participate in the Civil Rights Movement if St. Rosa Parks told you, "You better go get involved"? Well, that's what happened. To make a very long story short, it's all in the movie. It's all going to be in the movie. Dr. King went out front, and the funniest thing you've ever seen is five little white boys run through the black community in Montgomery, Alabama, trying to escape from our own police. These are the police that have protected us all our lives. And now, all of a sudden, we're outlaws because we did what? Went to a church and met some students who were doing non-violently what they could do to integrate lunch counters, theaters, bowling alleys, and so forth. Well, when we got back to campus, and we did escape, we were pretty good at running. We got back to campus, we were met by the whole administration of the college. President, all the deans and everything. And they said, you have to resign from school. The 5 of you. You've broken the law. You've broken disgrace upon the college. Disgrace upon the Methodist Church. It was the Methodist Church school. That night, the Klan marched on the campus and burned crosses around our dormitory. We were called into the office of the Attorney General of the state of Alabama. And he puffed himself up and he said, you have fallen under the communist influence. And we said, you mean there's communists in Alabama? He said, no, but they come through here. And you have all fallen under the communist influence. Because in those days, if you did anything about segregation or women's rights or labor rights, anything like that, you were under an alien influence. No, we knew that that was what it was America was supposed to be about. And we were living in a place where they were violating every democratic principle that our country was based on. Well, that's when I really knew that I had to really join the struggle. Let's see what's next on the thing. This is SNCC right here. There's me in 1963. There's my first wife, Dorothy. And these are all SNCC people. Julian Bond in the front. I knew after my experience at Huntington that I had to do something, so I joined SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. In my first 36 months of working with this organization, 8 of my friends and colleagues were murdered. They were killed. They lost their lives in Mississippi and Alabama and all across the South because we were working to register black people to vote. In the most democratic country on earth, we held ourselves up as a great beacon of freedom. But if you were black in Mississippi and you tried to register to vote, it was a capital crime. And these were veterans who had gone to fight in the Second World War to get the freedoms of democracy, to protect the world for democracy. And when they went back to Mississippi, they were sometimes lynched and shot and killed because they were wearing the U.S. uniform. That was what I had grown up with. These were the people that were my Southern people. That's why I had to do something. Let's see what's next. This is a brand new thing from the movie. It's called a lookbook. So they want to know how things look. That's the way I looked in 1962. It was when I was arrested in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. You know what I was charged with? Because we were trying to have students go down and integrate the lunch counters, register people to vote. Criminal anarchy. They said on or about the 17th day of February 1962, Bob Zellner and Chuck McDew. Chuck McDew was the African-American young man who was chairman of SNCC. They said Bob Zellner and Chuck McDew did with force of arms attempt to overthrow the government of East Baton Rouge Parish, Louisiana. The state of Louisiana and the United States of America. Because we were doing voter registration and nonviolent direct action. $14,000 we were on bail in Baton Rouge. Later on, some of us were charged here, not here, but nearby in Virginia, under the John Brown statute. We were charged with inciting the black population to acts of war and violence against the white population. That's the law that John Brown was hanged under. We were charged with capital offenses, not because we had involved ourselves in any violence or anything, because we were working in the movement. Let's see what's next. Thank you, Karen. Okay. There's the filmmakers, Spike Lee. Some people know Spike Lee. Barry Alexander Brown. Those are the people that are working on making this movie. Now, one of the ways that this movie starts is my first staff meeting. So I said after college I joined SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Well, SNCC was the young people's movement, part of the Civil Rights Movement. And when Dr. King and other people said, you can't do voter registration in Mississippi, it's too dangerous. That's where we went. That's what young people would do. If it was too dangerous to go, if it was too bad to work there, that's where we had to go. My first staff meeting of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee on October the 4th, 1961, was in Macomb, Mississippi. Moses had gone to work in Mississippi, then trying to develop voter registration campaign. I went to work with SNCC. My first day of work in Atlanta office was September the 11th, 1961. Right after that, Herbert Lee, who was a black farmer, had gone down to register to vote, and his next door neighbor, E.H. Hurst, who was a white member of the Mississippi State Legislature, after Herbert Lee went down to register to vote, his neighbor followed him to the cotton gin next morning in Liberty, Mississippi. Get the irony? Liberty, Mississippi. Followed him to the cotton gin, threatened him with a pistol, and when Herbert Lee tried to avoid him and move away, he shot him one time in the head, killing him instantly. Herbert Lee lay in the dust at the cotton mill, at the cotton gin, for 8 hours in the street while the white people got their coroner's inquest together and said there was no crime committed. And they forced the witnesses to say that Herbert Lee had attacked E.H. Hurst with a tire iron. Well, there was one black witness that was brave enough, Lewis Allen, to tell the story the way it was. He told the Justice Department, and then the Justice Department told the local police in Liberty that he had told the truth and said there was cold-blooded murder, and then Herbert Lee was murdered because he had witnessed the murder and he had testified to the federal government. So we found out right there that the federal government in 1961 was not going to do what was necessary to protect voter registration workers and black people who went down to register to vote. Well, SNCC had a policy, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, wherever the problem was, that's where we went. So our very first staff meeting of this organization was held in Macomb, Mississippi. And while we were there, 135 students, not from the college, but from the Berkland High School, marched out of school to go down and protest the murder of Herbert Lee. I was hired to be a campus traveler with SNCC. I was supposed to be going to white campuses in the South and kind of interpret or talk to white Southerners about what the movement was doing. Well, when the students came to where we were in the Elks Hall, they sat down and started making their protest posters. And I said to myself, well, I can't go. If I go, there'll be a lot of violence. And I can't go on this march. I'll be the only white person on the march. And what will happen to my father? He'll lose his church. My mother will lose her teaching job. She was teaching school. And then I thought to myself, what's going to happen to these young people? What's going to happen to their parents? And then I realized if I was going to be a part of this organization, SNCC, I had to go and do the things that SNCC was doing. So when they filed out, I just fell in line, and out I went on my first demonstration. As we left the black community was very excited and thrilled that this thing was happening in the deepest, darkest, Klan-infested part of Mississippi. When we crossed over the railroad tracks, everything got very quiet. People started gathering. The Klan mobilized instantly. They had big whip antennas. They started throwing rocks, bottles at the students. They would try to run over the students with their trucks. The students would scatter and come back together. We finally made it down to the town hall in Macomb, Mississippi. And we were stopped by a huge mob, 400 or more people in the middle of the street. So the students began to stand up on the steps of the City Hall, and they began to pray. The police would come over, grab them, and drag them off. While that was happening, a little group of Klansmen began to gather around me, and they began to hit me. And they would hit me, and then they would look at the police, and the police would say, with all their body language and everything, yeah, get that guy. That's a white guy. He's no business in a black demonstration, supporting black people, trying to get their freedom. So as they began to do that, Chuck McDew and Bob Moses, both African-American staff members of SNCC, came over and stood between me and the mob. And the police were enraged with this. The police came over immediately with big billy sticks. And for the first time in my life, I saw a human being hit with a piece of wood as hard as you could possibly hit anybody with a baseball bat or anything, and whacked right in the head. And for the first time, I saw head split and white bone showing through and a trickle of blood and more blows and more blows. And I began to think, if they would treat us like this out here, what are they going to do when they get us in their jail? What's going to happen? They beat Bob Moses and Chuck McDew and dragged them off. And then this little mob grabbed a hold of me and they started pulling me out into the street. The big mob was hollering, bring him here, we'll kill him. And I knew that if they were able to get me in that street, there was no power on earth that was going to keep me from being killed. I began to have a kind of an out-of-body experience. And I thought, these people are overreacting. This is my first demonstration. This is going to be the shortest civil rights career in history. It's going to kill me today. But I was highly motivated. Somebody had given me a Bible, and I remembered, I heard almost just like his real voice. I heard the voice of my father. And my father said, God helps those who help themselves. So I gently placed the Bible down on the steps, and I took a hold of the rail that was down the steps of the City Hall. And the mob was screaming, bring him here. The Klan people were trying to pull me loose from the mob, from the rail. Now, just for your own information, when I was in college, I was a martial arts instructor. So I was in pretty good shape. I was also, don't tell anybody this, I was also first dancer of the Montgomery, Alabama Civic Ballet. So those of you who know discipline in ballet know that that's a good discipline too. So I was in shape, and I was highly motivated. So they would try to pull me loose, and when they came back to get another pull, I would move up on the rail. And I began to have these really weird thoughts. I said, hey, I'm winning this, you know. Anyway, I worked, they would pull, and I would move up the rail. They were beating my hands with pipes. They had baseball bats, they had pipe wrenches, they had chains. They were beating my hands trying to get me loose from this rail. They got so frustrated that when I got up to the top of the steps, police are standing around watching the whole thing. I got up to the top of the steps. They were so frustrated that one of the mob members came over the back of my head and he began to put his fingers in my left eye socket. And I realized that he was trying to get a hold of my eyeball. And he would work my eyeball until he would almost get it between his thumb and forefinger. And I knew that he was going to pull my eyeball out. He was going to blind me because I had gone against the white Southern South. And I used my martial arts training, and I would wait till the moment that it was about to get it. I would move my head in such a way that my eyeball would thump back into my eye socket. Now, the reason I tell you this is I want young people to know what people went through to get this vote, this thing that they're still trying to restrict. This is what happened when we were trying to get the vote in Mississippi, in Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, for black people to register to vote. Well, anyway, you'll have to read the rest of the story in the book. Please get the book. Hopefully you'll watch the movie. I eventually made my way, or the police finally came. But what they actually did was they piled on top of me, and it finally broke me loose from that rail. And the last thing I remember, my head was sticking out of this group, and there was a big brown boot kicking me in the side of the head. And I remember thinking before I passed out, this is the way that I die. Now, it did a tremendous amount of good for me, because after that, I realized that everything was extra. In Louisiana, we have a phrase, lagniappe. It was a little bit extra. So every bit of my life since that point has been extra. God, or some force, has given me this opportunity to live to the age of 79. 79 now. Hope I only have another maybe 25 or 30 years to organize. You young people are going to have to come on and take over though, right? So that was the beginning of my experience with SNCC. I was arrested 18 times in SNCC. Finally, in 1967 and 68, it was time for us to go, all the white people in SNCC, to go and organize white folks. We had been in the comfort, basically, of the black community for a long time, and Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, other people in SNCC said, it's time for you to go organize white people. That was really terrifying, because now we're supposed to go and work with the people who've been shooting at us and gouging our eyes and trying to kill us all this time. We got to do that. Well, that's what we have to do today, too. We still have to go to those people who want to divide us, to have us fighting each other. We have to go with them. We have to go and begin to work with them. So I'm going to stop right there, maybe, because I want you to know that that experience with the early days of SNCC has formed and shaped my whole life. And if I didn't learn anything else from Martin Luther King and Mrs. Rosa Parks, is this: that brotherhood and sisterhood is not so wild a dream as those who profit by postponing it pretend. So they're pretending still, you know, from the president right on down to the extremists of all types, that we can't get together, that we have to be separate, that we have to be afraid of each other, and we have to hate each other. That's not true. They are pretending that brotherhood and sisterhood is not possible because they profit by pretending that. So that's what we have to do now. We have to pull together. There's tremendous, tremendous things happening in this country now. The women's movement, the LGBTQ movement, the young people's movement. Young people are coming into their own again. And if you can't be a revolutionary as a young person, you'll never be a revolutionary. Thank you. There are microphones out there, and if you have a question or a comment, it doesn't have to be a question, please talk. I know that there's, yes ma'am.
Could you talk about the white Southerners who also influenced you that worked for racial justice, like Virginia Durr or Ann Brady?
Yes, thank you very much. That's a good question about the white Southerners that influenced me. You know, all across the South in the 40s and the 50s, there were centers where you could go, like Highlander Folk School, Dorchester Center in Georgia. All over, there were places where people could get together, black and white. In Montgomery, Alabama, it's amazing because, you know, when the Attorney General in Montgomery said we had fallen under the influence of the communists, he told us, he said, I've got a list of names here I want you to watch out for. And so he began to list certain people. He said, that was after I had said, are the communists in Alabama? And he said, no, but they come through here. Well, he started listing some of the people. Carl and Ann Braden. Well, Ann Braden was from Anniston, Alabama. Clifford and Virginia Durr, they were from Montgomery, Alabama. Aubrey Williams was from Montgomery, Alabama. So over and over and again, he was telling us to avoid these people, or if they got in touch with us, to please let him know right away. He wanted us to be little spies now. And so these are the people who influenced us. Ella Baker was not a white influencer, but she was one of the prime people that we learned from. Daisy Bates in Little Rock. These are tremendous leaders in the movement. Virginia and Clifford Durr were people, they just took us in. They adopted all 5 of us. So we were mentored by Virginia and Clifford Durr and Martin Luther King and Mrs. Rosa Parks. And if you don't think you can get an education there about doing good and doing the right thing, that's where you go. Yes. Right there.
I don't need a mic. Okay. Thank you for being here, and also, sir, I'd like to know what help or lack of help were, say, the U.S. Marshals down in Alabama, Mississippi. Did they reluctantly help you all? Did they follow orders from Robert F. Kennedy? And then finally, I would also like to know what empathy did people have at the time for, say, Malcolm X and his message when people were being attacked, had fire hoses on them, dogs sicked on them, and that type of thing? I would think Malcolm X's message would have been very tempting.
Yes, okay, that's a good complex question. And it does remind me to go back and loop into the story. Part of the story of my Macomb experience, my first staff meeting, where the day I almost didn't survive, eventually they took me out to another county. They took me out of the jail, basically, in Macomb, Mississippi. We were turned over to the Ku Klux Klan, and they drove out of town with us. They went all the way, we went out into the field, and they had a hangman's rope, and they literally, I don't talk about this a lot, because they said, we're going to hang you with this rope from that limb. And I completely believed them. One of the members of the mob, the Klan, that was going to string me up was Doc, and he had been a classmate of mine at Huntington College. And he was head of the Klan faction at Huntington College when I guess I was one of the leaders of the civil rights thing. And it just happened that Macomb, Mississippi is where Doc lived. So he had told everybody that I was the one responsible for the whole thing. So they were going to string me up. In fact, the New York Times carried an article the next day after that march on October the 4th, 1961. New York Times had an article that said 135 high school students from Berglund High School marched out to protest the murder of Herbert Lee, led by Bob Zellner, field secretary for SNCC. It was my first demonstration. And Brenda Travis, who was a 16-year-old African-American high school student, she was the leader. She was 16 years old. But anyway, they eventually took me to Magnolia, Mississippi, put me in a little jail there. And that's when we were able to get the word out. And the FBI came to that jail, took me out of the cell, because they said, they're going to come and finish the job tonight. They're going to take you out of this jail and really kill you tonight. They took me out of the jail to take pictures of my eye and the rest of my wounds. And one of the FBI agents kind of sidled over to me and said, it was pretty rough out there on the City Hall steps, wasn't it? And I said, yeah, it was nip and tuck there for a while. I didn't know if I was going to make it. He said, well, I don't want you to think that you were alone. We were there. We wrote it all down. So they had taken notes on the lynching of Bob Zellner with no intention whatsoever to intervene, just to take the notes. So that was the protection that we had from the federal government. later on, when Meredith went to the University of Mississippi, and they were forced to bring in troops and so forth, many times that was still a very reluctant thing to do. Good question. What was the last part of the question?
Given the horrific treatment that you and others received, the message of Malcolm X, I would think, at that time would have had a certain appeal. And I'm trying to ask, you know, did he pick up any, for lack of a better term, street cred amid the turmoil? Because his message was a little more forceful than Dr. King.
Yeah. Well, in one sense, it was more forceful, but don't forget that Malcolm X was up in the north, and he was talking about, you know, organizing the black Muslims and about the white devils and all that. Dr. King and Malcolm X were symbiotic with each other. They were friends with each other, and Dr. King would say, Malcolm, good job, because I always tell them if they don't deal with me, they're going to have to deal with you. So there was a certain give and take. But the idea that violence was more militant than nonviolence was the idea that, well, we had to be pretty well trained and we had to be pretty disciplined, and you had to have a fair amount of courage to participate in nonviolence as well. And we had those debates always in the movement. So later on, there was a parting of the ways. But in general, when you want to make a revolution, I still believe in Dr. King's way, because if you have a nonviolent revolution, you have concern for your enemy, and you have concern for your tactics and so forth. In a violent struggle, then you sow more seeds of more discord down the way. So I still believe in the nonviolent direct action. And you know, we're going to have to capture some of these people now in this country who want to take us away from our democracy. And how do you capture somebody nonviolently? I'm not sure. Maybe you young people will be able to figure that one out. But Malcolm X made a tremendous change, of course, after he went to Mecca. Yeah. Because he became, and in our classes we discussed the difference between narrow black nationalism and revolutionary black nationalism. And black nationalism is a very good thing. Black power was a huge advance, because all of a sudden black is beautiful. The heritage of the black struggle became very, very important. And this was to combat all of the filth that our educational system had fed us about black and white. So when Malcolm X went to Mecca, he saw fellow Muslims with blonde hair, white skin, blue eyes. He realized that it wasn't a skin problem then. He realized it was a heart problem. And it was a question of being a revolutionary in favor of human beings and the human race, rather than a reactionary wanting to destroy the human race. So he went from a narrow nationalism, I think, to a revolutionary nationalism. And when the Black Panthers were formed, they said, Black Panthers all of our Black Panthers will be black, but we'll work with every revolutionary of every color. So Black Panthers had a very open relationship with all of the other people in the civil rights struggle. So that's the important thing we have today. And today we have even a broader alliance. In those days we talked about black and white. And now we talk about gay and straight, black and white, native and immigrants and LGBT, so forth. We have a huge, huge coalition. I work with Reverend Barber in North Carolina. We have 250 organizations that have joined together so that everybody working on climate, women's rights, voting rights, all of these things, everybody works on their issue and everybody else's issue. And that's spreading now across the country. And we have we've renewed Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign, when he said we had to go to a thorough economic and revolution of values. So that's on the plate right now in this country. And we're learning that sometimes identity politics separates us. But when we come together in coalition, we are tremendously strong. It's at least 2/3 of our country against 1/3. 1/3 is in power right now, and in a democratic country, that's not going to work.
Thank you.
There's one right here. Hi, I'm Bill Heath, the author of The Children Bob Moses Led. One of the things I learned from your book that I really didn't know much about was how violent things were in Danville, Virginia, and particularly the Bloody Monday. And since that's closer to home, you alluded to it with the John Brown statue.
Yeah.
But could you tell people a little bit more about that? Because that doesn't usually get the coverage Birmingham and other places do.
Yes, thanks for the question. Yeah, Danville, Virginia, that was in the summer of 1963. And Danville, Virginia is almost left out of the narrative of the Civil Rights Movement. And one of the reasons is that Danville, Virginia was so violent, and they had the police and Dan River Mills and the other right-wing forces in Danville, Virginia in 1963 had a policy of letting absolutely no news to get out of Danville, Virginia. So when we had one of the demonstrations in Danville, we had a situation where, first of all SNCC field secretaries, we had cameras, and we all knew how to write news articles and things like that. So this particular night, there was a demonstration at the jail. The jail the courthouse was here, and there was the alleyway, and then there was the jail. And there was a huge night march in Danville, because that's when the working people would be able to come. And in fact, my wife Dorothy, who was, we were engaged at that time, was in the march. And all of the news people from all over the country were in Danville, Virginia, because Dr. King had come. There was a whole summer of activity in Danville, Virginia. And all of the nation's news media were lined up there. And as the march came in to where the jail is and the county courthouse, all of a sudden behind them came the firemen and all of the deputized garbage workers. All the garbage workers were white. They had all been armed with table legs from a local furniture maker. Table legs were the length of table legs, about this big around, and they were all armed with that. As the fire trucks were unfurling the fire hoses and the garbage men were arming themselves with their table legs, all these cameras were shut off. Turned off all the lights and everything. So I asked the press, I wasn't in the demonstration, I asked the press if they were going to take pictures, and I realized they were not. So I said, you need to do it like this, and I walked forward as the parade knelt to pray, and Chief McCain, I believe his name was, came up and said, there will be no praying here tonight. I walked up with my little camera, and I had a flash on it, and I took a picture. He stood up, he walked over to me, he said, okay, Zellner, that's it. He took my camera from around my neck, took the strap, and he banged my camera 3 times on the pavement, pulled the film out, pulled it out like that, and he said, anybody else want to take any pictures? Nobody would take a single picture. They hospitalized 123 people that night. Hospitalized. Women with their breasts split open, heads split open, eyes knocked out. The most bloody thing that you've ever seen. The hospital was covered with blood. The doctors were sewing people up, and there was a local person with a Super 8 had taken all of these photographs just in the hospital. Now they knew that this film had been taken. They got it out of the hospital. They brought it into the church where some of us were taking sanctuary, and they gave it to Avon Rollins and myself. And James Foreman said, do your best to get this out of Danville, get it to Washington, D.C., so we can get it on TV, so that people will know what's happening in Danville, Virginia. And that night, about 2:30, we took that film, and we tried to get it out of the church. We went out of the church quietly in the back, and there was a big gully in the back of the church. We knew how to get through the gully, and there was a taxi cab on the other side of the gully that was going to take us to a car that was set somewhere outside of town. We were going to take that film to D.C. As we approached the lip of the gully, all of a sudden lights came on from everywhere. Police were screaming around the church, and they began to shoot at us. And at first I thought, well, they must be shooting over our heads. And I looked, and those fire from those rifles and guns, and you could hear the bullets going by your ears. And Avon and I both ran around the church, got back to the front of the church, got inside the church. We stayed the rest of the night in the church. The next morning, they broke the church doors down and searched everybody in the church to find that film. But we had already gotten out of the church with some of the women that had gotten that film out of the church. And eventually it was shown, that film. But that's how tremendously determined that little town was, that nothing about their civil rights movement was going to get outside Danville. They stifled the whole thing. So that was one of the things, and it's really basically left out of the civil rights narrative because there are no pictures. There's very few newspaper articles about Danville, Virginia in 1963.
Hi, I was just wondering, listening to you, about a month or so ago, I was reading a book about it was called Blood Brother, and Jonathan Daniels. I was just wondering, by chance, did you cross paths with him in your endeavors?
Yes. Well, Jonathan Daniels was murdered in Lowndes County, I believe, and Jonathan Daniels was a young seminarian who gave his life to save some other civil rights people because I think it was Coleman was the murderer. This was in Lowndes County. They were used to white people killing black people whenever they stood up and tried to free themselves. And they were Jonathan Daniels and Ruby Sales, I believe. There were several people, and another priest as well were let out of jail. And they wanted to go to the little store so they could call somebody. And when they walked into the store, Coleman confronted him with a shotgun and was about to shoot Ruby Sales. And Jonathan Daniels pushed her out of the way and took the full blast of the shotgun, and it was murdered. So Jonathan Daniels was not the only one. There was Reeve was killed in Selma. So there was a tremendous bloodbath around there. But people would not be stopped. SNCC had already worked in Selma for about 3 years before Dr. King came there. And the way Selma started working was even SNCC had a big red X around Selma, Alabama. That was one place that we couldn't get anybody to go there because it was too dangerous. And Bernard Lafayette said, I want to have a project. And James Foreman said, we don't have anything available. Only thing that's available is Selma, and we're not going to send anybody there. And Bernard Lafayette said, I'll go to Selma. So that was what SNCC did. But that was a tremendous example of someone giving their life for this movement.
Well, I'm Jerry Dorsey. I grew up here in Carroll County, and it's what you said about the government there and the people fighting and holding everything back. I was the first Negro student in Carroll County Public School Systems. And the school system here, for years, tabled the segregation of Humanities Elementary School from any blacks attending. I lived a mile from it. But the government, not as violent as it was in Danville, but the same processes were held that you were held back because you were black, a mile to school from my house. But the fighting they did was internal in their system so that no one could progress into a school with better education and a better learning situation. And their final straw was in '63. The daughter.
Could you put the mic a little
I'm sorry. Their final straw in '63. I think the daughter, Ferguson, just recently died from Plessy versus Ferguson. Her parents had to write a letter requesting that she attend the school being a black student. Well, that was Carroll County's last step for any black student attending the school system. So my parents wrote a letter requesting that I attend. It's going to be 5 of us. No one went with me but me because they figured the KKK was going to kill us. No one ever did. But the government systems, not as violent as Danville, still had the same powers and processes to retain things. And then the last final step, when we got this, my parents got the letter saying that I could attend the school a mile from my house. We had to pay $1.50 a month. We had to ride the bus for 3 years to school a mile from my house. So the government systems, ignorant as they were, they had their own little idiosyncrasies of holding people back, and still today we can see that.
Yeah, if anybody has any other experiences they'd like to share, I appreciate it very much. Yes, there's one or two.
So like of all the marches and like demonstrations you've done, was there any like backlash? Not backlash, but did anybody, because you were the only white person for some of them, was there any issue from the black people saying that they kind of wanted to do it by themselves, like they wanted to do this by themselves? It's amazing that you helped, and it was amazing what you've done, but did any of them ever have an issue with it?
Yes, okay, did anybody have an issue with it? Well, in the very early period, the question was there any resentment, I think, inside the movement, but with movement people, that I was a white Southerner to be involved at this level? And I don't think so, not in the early days, because in the early days, the students were so dedicated, and they knew, if you went to work with SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, you had to be ready to die, basically. And if you had that level of commitment, and you were working with other people, and we saw people die. I think I mentioned that in my first 36 months, 8 of my comrades were murdered and killed in one way or another. In the summer of '64, Silas McGee was shot in the side of the head. I caught him as he fallen to the ground with a .38 caliber slug in the side of his head. So these were experiences that we went through together, and we were welded together in the strongest bonds that you could think of, because we were all also following people who had set an impossible standard of courage and conduct. Ann Brayton was one of those people. Ann Brayton. She set an incredible level of accomplishment of work for us, especially the white students. Ella Baker, a tremendous level of courage. Mrs. Rosa Parks. People think of Mrs. Rosa Parks as a tired seamstress who was too tired to give up her seat. She was an activist. She investigated rapes and lynchings and so forth long before the Montgomery bus boycott. These are people of huge stature that we were doing our best to follow. And we had other people like Reverend Lee in Mississippi, many other people who had given their lives for this cause, who had gone to fight in Europe for freedom and came back and didn't have the same freedoms themselves that they were fighting for. So in the early days, no, there was not that. There was no resentment there. Yes, ma'am.
I have two comments and a question. I hear the emotion in your voice.
Yes.
And I am so moved. So totally moved by the emotion that you still feel many years later. I too was part of the desegregation in Carroll County, and what makes me sad is that I now am having conversations with my grandsons about if they're ever stopped by the police,
Yes.
what to say, how to act. And I look back at what I went through, going through desegregation in Carroll County, and I am 70 years old.
Yeah.
And back then I hoped that by the time I become a grandmother,
Yes.
that I would not have to address these issues. So if you could just speak very, a little on the racial polarization that is taking place in this country now.
Yes, thank you so much. And one of the things I'd like to point out is that all of those students in Carroll County, Little Rock, and other places, you were all heroes and sheroes, because in many cases, those children didn't tell their parents even what was happening to them in school, because they didn't want the parents to pull them out. They were so dedicated. They were going to stay the course, and they were tremendously harassed and persecuted in those schools. It's pitiful that we went through this 50 or 60 years ago, and some people are trying to take us back to that very same place, and we will not let it happen. As long as there's breath in our bodies, we won't let it happen. And I do apologize for the emotion. For a long time, it was only Vex or other things. I have rather extreme post-traumatic stress now, and I'll jump at the least thing. And a lot of us do, but we carry on. We carry on. I think sometimes also the people who went through this, sometimes they have not shared this history with their own children and their own grandchildren because they don't want to maybe inflict them with this pain that some people went through. But there's two sides to that. That we need to talk about this history. We need to talk about this glorious, glorious history of struggle in this country, of all of these different movements. And now the young people are coming on. I think that we were incredibly surprised and impressed by the rapidity that the LGBTQ movement made. We had no idea that it would progress that fast. But part of it is the young people don't see the same kind of divisions that we saw. And to have adults like our president and others trying to instill that hatred again in them, it is the most reprehensible thing that can happen. We're not going to put up with it. We're going to gather together. We're going to put our strength together. We're going to take our country, and we're going to save our democracy. We'll save our climate. And the young people, if we can't do that, humans are just going to go down the tube, basically. Yes, sir.
Can you hear me up here?
Oh, I can, yes. Aaron?
No, over here.
Oh, over there. Okay, hi.
I just have 3 questions that I'm going to try to ask as quickly as possible. What was the hardest part about breaking away from your own family and joining the struggle for civil and human rights? of everything that you experienced in the 60s, was there one particular experience that was more impactful in terms of shaping the person that you are? And just to go back to my first question before I ask my last one, if racism isn't genetic and discriminatory attitudes are genetic, how do you explain the fact that you still have chapters of the Klan and other white supremacy groups actively organizing in public in the 21st century? And my last question to you is, if identity politics is a negative force, what can moderate Democrats and liberal Republicans like me do to push this country forward without knocking us over the cliff?
Okay, good. Thank you so much. Well, one of the, I guess probably the most impactful thing that occurred in my life was, first of all, my father having the intestinal fortitude once he found out that his Klan beliefs were not compatible with his Christian beliefs, and he had the experiences that he had, that he had the courage to break from not only the Ku Klux Klan, but from all of the history that he and his family had soaked up in the slave-owning mentality of the South. So that was impactful for me. The second one, thing that was tremendously impactful was meeting Mrs. Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King before she was Saint Rosa Parks, and before he was Saint Martin Luther King. He was just a very brave, small, incredibly courageous Baptist preacher named Mike. When I first met him, everybody called him Mike. He wasn't even Martin Luther King at that time. Later, he became Martin Luther King. So those were the impactful things. The second thing I think you asked was, what was the second thing? It has to do with the fomenting of hate and violent division between us. Okay,
would you like me to ask the question again?
Just the second part. I can't remember the second part. Yes.
Because we don't have evidence that racism is passed on in the genetic code, how do you explain the continued resilience of the Klan and other hate organizations in the second decade of the 21st century?
Okay, yeah, that's a very good question, a deep question. How do we explain the resilience of this racism after all the experience that we've had? Well, I think part of that answer is that we have not really dealt with it as a country. You know, racism, a lot of it was invented in this country. The definition of whiteness was invented to separate slavery or make slavery attached to a color. And that was incredibly hurtful for our country. That our country that is democratic was based in the very beginning that some humans were full humans and some people were just partly human. Three-fifths of a person, I guess. And it was for the rights of the slave part of the country, the Deep South, that was formulated. So from the very beginning, those of you who are scholars will learn about the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery was so that during the age of discovery, if the explorers found countries where there were people that didn't know Jesus and didn't know Christ, they weren't Christians, you could take their land, take their gold, and so forth. So all of slavery was based on that same theory. And all of the acquisition and genocide against the Native Americans was based on that. our country is still based on that premise that some people are full people and some people are not full people. And we now have, I don't say they're Republicans, I say they're extremists that want to go back to that kind of government and society where the power rests with males, men who are white and who are wealthy. That's the basis of their whole philosophy. Well, that is antithetical to democracy. So that's why that racism is so virulent and so lasting, because we as a country have not, number one, confessed. You can't have reconciliation or forgiveness without confession. We've never confessed it. We haven't yet, and I don't know if we will or not. But we're going to have to deal with that eventually before we can move on. So, and that's being used in a very cynical way now. The other side of it, I think that you may be getting to something. Sometimes it seems that things are hardwired, you know? Some people can have sympathy for their fellow human beings, and some people simply do not experience that. They simply do not have sympathy or empathy for another person. One example is my own brother. There were 5 boys, and the youngest one has gone back, basically, to the Klan mentality, and has gone back. And it may be, and I love my brother. He's my baby brother, and he is going back to he supported Roy Moore when we worked for to change the situation in Alabama. Pamela and I worked for Doug Jones in Alabama. We were able to elect Doug Jones in Alabama because there was a bridge too far for most people. A bridge too far to support that man. But some people did. My brother was the only person in Daphne, Alabama, Baldwin County, across the bay from Mobile. He was the only one that put up a Roy Moore sign on his property. And he had the effrontery to put up a Roy Moore sign on my lot, which is next door. So that's a bridge too far for me. So we took Doug Jones signs and put it all around his Roy Moore sign. So there are some people that may be hardwired and just not able to have the kind of sympathy and empathy it takes. Because I do not understand to this day why people will devote their whole lives to getting more money and more power for people who already have more money and more power than they know what to do with. Why on earth would we do that? And why would we have a tax system now that for the incredibly wealthy people, now they want to pay up to 10% of their hundreds of millions of dollars maybe they make a year. They want to pay 10%. And they want to keep 90%. So individuals can own more property and more money than countries, whole countries can own. That's something that couldn't happen under Reagan, couldn't happen under Clinton, because under those tax systems, which was a progressive tax system, if you made several $100 million in a year, you got to keep 10% of it, and you paid 90% in taxes, basically. We have switched that completely around now. And democracy cannot stand that degree of redistribution of wealth from middle and working class people to people who already have incredible amounts of money. So it's very simple. There's the 1% and there's the 99%. I think the 99% are going to reassert themselves.
Thank you all so much for coming.